I'm really pleased to give a little introduction today to today's speaker, Jason Cherry. Jason is a longtime friend now of the Trent House. We first met when, and he'll have to help me remember the exact date, a few years ago when he was beginning or continuing some of his research on Trent's youngest son, William, who you'll learn more about today. And he learned that we had the original vest that the younger Trent wore at the court of St. James when he went there, and we'll hear more about why he did that. And he came to see it, and we got introduced to him. And since then, he has been a wonderful ally and consultant in our work.
Acquainted myself with the Trent House because I was doing research, for years, basically, that accumulated being a member of the reenactment group that portrays, the French Indian War period for this, at the time, Captain William Trent. And his company. So by doing so and trying to find the basis of the research of his involvement with building a fort in Western Pennsylvania is what sort of brought me to the Trent House of himself, just doing research and, finding out about this vest or waistcoat that was the sort of tracing. I happened to stumble across it in a picture and was trying to see like who had it or if it was privately owned and was able to trace it that when I had contacted, I think the Old Barracks Museum actually had it on display, if I'm correct there, Sam.
That's something it did, yes.
Right. And so when I asked them, they said, no, we don't have it, but I believe the William Trent House does. And I'm like, oh, okay. So then I was able to I believe, call and leave a message at least, I think, and they got back to me. And I think I talked to Sean, I believe, and whoever else, and that sort of got us for me to eventually come out and view the vest. And it's it's amazing when you walk in the footsteps. I think the basis, especially when I'm doing stuff, is to see that stuff up front. If it's not just the original letters, it's the the items. Now, unfortunately, there aren't as many items out there than there is that we can eventually see that was owned by Trent. But just walking in the presence of the house and, and then in the grounds and then just seeing these original letters is what basically interests me for not only this book that just came out here in 2019, but now it was sort of always been a part of being a smaller project. The Pittsburgh's Lost Outpost was basically just focused on that certain event, whereas this complete biography I'm trying to do right from, birth till death of William Trent. And I remember during here back when, about a year ago, actually, almost, I think I suggested the idea of possibly, sort of like, things that we need to know about William Trent. And I think that's what led us to, Sam and I went back and forth, and even Sean, I believe, that was like, wow, this would be awesome to hopefully do something that, some lesser known facts or stuff of Trent's role in history, especially. And it's even amazing, even now looking back at it, I think, looking at the original script that we have for this project, that's even as I'm writing it right now, the biography, that I've even found more stuff that, eventually will come out to light here as the more I keep delving into it. I sort of don't want to get involved in put a lot of, irons into the fire because it, leads you on all these paths. So it's to a point that I stick to where the years are and go where it follows me. So at this point, it was just sort of getting a nice tidbit and get people excited about that, William Trent was so involved over the course of his life. And I think that's what led us to this project here. And you figure we started this back in, I think, almost the spring, like April last year. And it's, so it's been, thankfully with everything that's been going on, and it's been hard just because of the fact of, all the things that we had with the pandemic and everything. So it was amazing to be able to present and do all this today to show this video, which, I saw a preview of it last night and was, very pleased on how everything turned out. And I think it'll be, everybody will enjoy it immensely.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. And do you have anything you'd like to kick off with? And do we have any questions?
Hey, Sam, I think we did get a question. Now that I'm looking at
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
Answer it for us.
Yeah, it said, did William take sides? Well, it's funny because there were, numerous contemporary accounts that were basically, sort of what was Trent's actually, was he, loyalist? Was he? And it's funny, they based it on who he sort of encountered with. Now, we mentioned briefly about William Franklin, and William Franklin is at the start of the Rev War, of course, became a loyalist, which is why he sort of had a falling out with his father, at least when he moved to England. And William Franklin and Trent actually had a sort of a acquaintance for years, because it started in 1746 during King George's War, when I think Franklin was not even like 16 years old. And then 2 years later, believe it or not, Conrad Weiser, another Indian interpreter, and traveled with William Franklin and Trent, and they weren't sure how William Franklin or Ben was able to get, his dad was able to get why William would go along on this journey to the Forks of the Ohio to meet the Indians in 1748. And they think it was probably because of his acquaintance with being, at the time, Captain William Trent. So, and eventually they would coerce during the Rev War. But actually, Trent in 1778, around that time is when they were giving the oaths of allegiance to show, was it for the patriot cause? Was it for the loyalist cause? And Trent would actually give an oath. The actually original was in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And it actually says he gave his oath of allegiance to the patriot cause in New Jersey, despite, like I said, despite knowing that he did a lot of business, especially with the known loyalists. I guess the other question to sort of answer was, do we know the cause of his death? As far as from what I based on the research, like I said, he had been suffering from illnesses, and I think it was related to, in summer of 1749, he actually contracted malaria. And they think it was because of his first trip to England, of bringing it back, because England was rampant at that time with, or what they called it, intermittent fever at the time. And eventually he contracted it in summer of 1749. And it seemed like they didn't know really how to treat it then. So it's possible he would write later on. There were numerous letters throughout his life from that date on that he'd say he would have what he believed was gout or possibly even arthritis. And he was starting to get it too bad that he actually went blind in one eye eventually when he came back from England the second time, almost about the start of the Revolution. So a lot of this stuff, from what I believe, it's possible he suffered from like rheumatoid arthritis. And it got so bad that the treatments for it, they didn't have much. Eventually, made it into a point that it looks like it's possible that what sort of led to, over this treatment of numerous things that led to not treating it correctly because they didn't really know how to, what led to his eventual illness and death there in December of 1784. So as of right now, that's basically what I have. And I'll find out more as I keep, sort of perusing these letters as I keep writing about his life. And as far as the last question, what do I know about his wife? I do know for a fact that his wife was named, her former name was Sarah Wilkins. And we only know that because there's only like 3 or 4 things of references to it. But the original was, he wrote a will in 1775 coming back from England. Maybe thinking that the voyage would be too bad coming back. And in this will, he actually said, well, if judging upon my death, my wife is Sarah Wilkins, because our marriage certificate or proof of our marriage has been destroyed. So it was the only proof that if he would die and the thing would go to her, that he wanted to make sure the money or what his worth was, as far as valued in his accounts, went to her. And he did mention her former name was Sarah Wilkins, just to make sure legally. Because we only see a couple more things later on, but we do know that he did eventually turn over the business, his business sort of stateside in the colonies went to her. She sort of, while he was gone from 1769 to 1775, she ran any type of business he had with people in the colonies, based on with all the 5 children she had at the time. So at least that were living with her when they were in South Trenton, New Jersey.
So what you see here, I put up on the screen, this is one of the many things that Jason has shared with us. This is the Trent family tree. Now we've highlighted for our purposes in the red box, William Trent, Judge Trent. but you can see down below, there's Major William Trent, was the only surviving child of William Trent's second marriage to Mary Coddington. And there you show his Major Trent's marriage to Sarah Wilkins and their children. I just want to point out a couple of other things that we learned from Jason's work on this family tree. So for one thing, William, this is a series of Williams you see here. So you start with William Trent of Inverness, then his son William, our Judge William Trent, and then Major William Trent, the son. But Judge Trent's father was also a merchant and a tax collector, and so he sort of carried on the family tradition. Jason has found out, and I'd be interested to hear from him how he determined this, that Judge Trent's mother was Swedish. The other interesting thing on here was several interesting things. Our Judge Trent was married to Mary Burge and had 3 sons by her. And for a long time, we at the Trent House had thought there was another Mary who was a daughter. So we knew about James Trent, Morris Trent, and John Trent, but we also thought there was a Mary Trent, a child of Judge Trent. Jason has did some research, and we now believe that that was not the case. And I, again, would love to have Jason tell us a little bit about that. So Jason, do you have any things you want to share with us on how you tracked down Trent's mother from Sweden, and whether or not whether our Judge Trent had a daughter?
Sure. Yeah. I guess what, it's always, I think I mentioned a little earlier, was just, it's amazing when you find one sort of piece of info, whether it be a letter or some kind of receipt, and then you see another name, and it's sort of, I said, sometimes it feels like you're in the movie National Treasure, where one clue leads to another clue. And it gets to the point where, and you run off of that, or, maybe you look at it and then a couple of days later, you come back and look at it again and go, oh, I didn't think of that. Or maybe I read something else that sort of triggers something. But yeah, the idea of the Isabella being from Sweden was, I guess it went back of, I was able to come across, I went in this, what was called scotlandspeople.com, and it had most of the wills that were in Scotland that you can, for a certain price, a couple pounds or so, you can look up if you know the names and different things. And I was noticing how when I just typed in Trent, there were a lot of them. And I was going through sort of trying to track down, sort of giving the basis of the sort of the family tree so I could sort of see it visually. And I think the Isabella thing came up because when I was researching, there was a James as well that was a brother of Judge Trent. And he came around, and he's mentioned a few times in Philadelphia, late 1690s, like 1696, 1697, of landing in, which was at the time called Upland, which is sort of the Swedish communities that were in like Chester County, Philadelphia County area. And when I was doing more research on just James, a unpublished account I was able to find online said that James, it was a reference to him being in the Swedish Navy. And I was curious and followed it up and was able to see that there were records. And so I went over and actually contacted one of the archives in Sweden and was able to, they were able to send me at least a document, or at least a document revolving with James and William. And when it came up, signed on there, Isabella's name was signed on the bottom. And it's spelled with the, and I did more research on like the spelling of the name, because the name had the 2 S's in it, which is sort of the equivalent back then when they basically signed for the Swedish sort of name. And then when I did more of it, it said that, as much as I believe at that early time, especially, mid 1650s on, there was sort of after the wars that were going on at the time, there was sort of a Swedish invasion into Scotland of like immigrants coming over, sort of equivalent from like when the Jacobites came over from Scotland over to the colonies. So by that time, it's not uncharacteristic or impossible to think that she traveled over and just happened to, at that time, especially being in the area of Inverness and stuff, of running into, at that time, William Trent of Inverness, Judge Trent's father, which led me to believe to that. And doing more, I sort of still try to look up stuff, but that's what sort of got me into the James being in there, and that his, further, there were a couple wills available. There's one in London and there's one actually in Philadelphia of this James, the brother of Judge Trent. But then that sort of, as I sort of was working my way down the tree, that's when I got to Judge Trent and his family with his oldest son, James. And then there was a John Trent, and also where they spelled it either, it was like Maurice or Morris, as Sam said, because it multiple phonetic spellings depending on people pronounced it. And it always been known in the contemporary, by numerous books, that there was a sister named Mary Trent, and her, and it being the sister of this Major William Trent, or Captain Trent. And I wanted to go in further because there's really no records on her. And I just thought it was weird that there wasn't even a mention. I had Maurice, which would have been her supposed brother, and I had his will, and he actually gives a plot of land to his beloved brother, William, who at that time would have been, maybe 9 or 10 years old. And then he is James's oldest, but there's no mention of a Mary there. And I was trying to figure out, where she fit into the equation here. And so when I looked up, it said, well, she was married to a merchant and creditor named Nathaniel French. Well, I was able to stumble across a land deed with Nathaniel French, and it said he was living in Antigua. And like I said, this was one of those things where it was leading one led to another. So I tried to see if they had any records in Antigua, and believe it or not, there were a few that I was able to find online, which was fortunate enough. And it actually had a family tree of the Frenches, and mentioned he did marry a Mary. And I'm like, oh, okay. So maybe this is this Mary, and it said Mary French, but didn't say her maiden name on it. So I thought, well, I'm assuming it was a Trent. So it said that, so I sort of followed her. It said she remarried and married another, I believe it was a Debney, was a name John Debney, I believe was the husband she married after Nathaniel French died in 1746. Well, I followed that up, and it said she had a will in London. So I followed it up to the same one, and she mentions a sister named Abigail Street, and goes through and mentions her parents. It's amazing what you can find in certain documents, especially wills. But in that will in particular, she happened to mention she was her mother, she was the daughter of, and she said the names. And then I'm looking back and looking compared to this, and it said, yeah, she was married to Nathaniel French of Antigua. And I said, well, why was this not? I said, there's no mention of Trent or anything in this, or that her name was, and it said her maiden name was Street, Streate. So then after I did research on it, I verified that that's what was her name, and she's buried in London. And it turns out that I said, well, maybe that's why there were no records, because it's possible that it was always believed she was with Nathaniel French being involved, especially with Judge Trent's will, and James Trent, the oldest son's will, being that they really didn't have wills, more of they were letters of administration, meaning that they'd never had a will written, so they had to have creditors take charge. Well, Nathaniel French was one of the people that were in charge. And for some reason, somebody assumed that his wife was in fact the sister of, or daughter of, Judge Trent, and a sister of Major Trent. And it was, and it just went on running. And like you said, unfortunately, nobody really questioned it, because the first person that did it sort of did like a chain reaction, and everybody just assumed that it was, which is, in my research, it's always, I got to have the primary source, or right off the bat, or I sort of dismiss it as, or at least think it's questionable. And I think with that one, the research paid off of trying to follow the paper trail, because, I think I went to Sam on this and said, I could find little or nothing in these records. And that's probably why, because I don't think that was never a Trent in the first place.
It gives us an interesting story to tell when we show our visitors when we can, when the house is able to be open, and we show them the small bedroom on the second floor. We have the bedroom of William Trent, the young son, Mr. Trent's bedroom, Mrs. Trent's bedroom, and there's another small bedroom on the second floor. And we used to say, oh, and this is Mary Trent, Judge Trent's daughter, who, when she came to visit, she would stay here, gave a nice little story. Well, we have to change our storyline there because we didn't think there was a Mary Trent, but it gives us an opportunity to really talk about how history, we think we have the facts, who was in the family. We don't always have the facts, and sometimes we have to step back and rethink and build on, as Jason said, primary sources. One of the other things that Jason did for us was find the original certificate, essentially, of marriage between William Trent, our Judge Trent, merchant of Philadelphia, and Mary Coddington. This is that actual document that he shared with us. I don't know if you have anything to say, Jason, about how you found it. What does it tell you that we may not have known before?
Well, and it's funny because, and this was another thing of looking in the research. We, my mom and I did numerous things in Philadelphia at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And if for any of you out there that have never been there, it is a tremendous thing, especially with involving the colonial Philadelphia. But it has in my opinion, has the greatest collection of Trent letters there is. I mean, as far as, and it has all the Ohio Company papers. It has the William Penn correspondence. I think there's 1 million. I think I was told there was 1 million worth of documents just involving Pennsylvania's history. And, they have numerous things there. And it seems like every time I go back there, I've probably, at this point, I think I've been 6 or 7 times. I've gone there. I think I've gone there so much, actually, the staff that worked there actually knew me by name coming in. Oh, what are you working on today? But yeah, this document was one of those things where we were researching. I was just trying to find anything in anything that had to do with Trent for the French and Indian War time period. And going into the James Hamilton, who was the governor of Pennsylvania, late 1740s or so, early 1750s, I came into his papers and it said they had folders on William Trent. Well, I'm going through, and there are numerous, could be, ones that were letters or numerous, basically for the French Indian War time period, like 1752, 53, early on before it started. And I came across this wedding certificate, and I'm looking at it, I'm reading it on, this is great that, and it's funny, it was logged in there. They have an old card catalog at Historical Society of PA. And it's funny, the people that work there don't sort of dismiss it. They don't say, well, it's sort of archaic now. We would rather use a more modern day system, and we have this digital records that we can look online. But we happened to be looking at the card catalog there because they basically cataloged everything that they have in their system for the most part. And it mentioned that there was a marriage record. Well, we happened to see this, and it was labeled, it was assumed that this was, Captain or, eventually Major Trent. But if you look at the date on there, the very bottom, it says this 22nd of July, 1710. And of course, this was way before, Captain or Major was born. So I realized that this was actually the Judge Trent, Trent's father, is marriage certificate to his second wife, Mary Coddington. And the thing that we, looking more at it is, it lists him being, has his occupation there being a merchant. But Mary Coddington, going into further detail, the Coddingtons, she was the stepdaughter of Anthony Morris. And Anthony Morris was one of the really big Quaker merchants in Philadelphia. In fact, started Morris Brewery that became, at one time, was the oldest running brewery. And I think it closed in the 1950s. And it started in 1683. And so it was one of those things where she was so prominent in the Quaker community that, and it wasn't uncommon for people to marry this, but Mary Coddington, based on her year that she was born, and this year here of being, I think it says it was witnessed there on July 22nd, but the marriage itself, or at least according to this wedding certificate, was July 20th, 1710. Mary Coddington, like I said, was a Quaker, whereas William Trent was Church of England, and it says it on here, according to the thing of Church of England, by virtue of His Excellency. And if you notice, back then, normally a person that was, Church of England or basically that was trying, or Anglican is what they called it, would try to marry other Anglicans. If you married a Quaker, they would not recognize it in the actual, unless she converted, they did not recognize it in the Anglican Church. At the time, at this point, the big church that Trent would eventually become a vestryman at, his dad would be a vestryman at, would be Christ Church in Philadelphia. And of course, being that Mary Coddington was in the prominent Quaker community, the Quakers would never approve of this marriage. So being in that, and not only that, she was also about 17 when she got married. So being that she was under the age of 18, they had to have the approval of the parents. Now, her mother had died at that time, and so did, and like I said, her father did not survive even before they moved. So it had come to that they had to get married somewhere, and it wasn't uncommon where they would get married either in somebody's house or somewhere that would recognize it. And for this, if you notice, the certificate it's under the virtue of Governor Hunter. And I think I went this through a few times, realizing that it said the province of New Jersey. And, Trent was living in Philadelphia at the time, so it wasn't an uncommon thing to cross the river and get married over in New Jersey. It's quite possible. And then George Ross at the time was the Christ Church rector, but because he couldn't recognize it at Christ Church, he probably accompanied Trent or so and probably got married over in New Jersey. It probably would have been outside of, because he had a lot of affiliate with the St. Mary's of Burlington Church. And I even looked at those records just to see, well, maybe he's listed there. And they, it's possible it could have been lost over the years, and they might have. But it looks like possibly they probably just got married at probably his former brother-in-law, Daniel Cox's house. He lived in Burlington. They both were vestrymen together at one point and did a lot of stuff for the Anglican Church over in Burlington. So it's quite possible they acquired George Ross, and they got married over in New Jersey, and then eventually came back to Philadelphia, which is why he signed it here, and got it recognized. Because normally they would have that bands, they called it marriage bands, which would go through the church and recognize if anybody had any objections to it. Well, if you had the money, you could just pay for the wedding certificate and have somebody witness it. And it looked like Judge definitely had the money for it. And from what I've found, this was a marriage certificate, meaning that they would have had this immediately after they got married. So which, like says it on here, it was July the 20th. And then George Ross signed it as an official witness on July 22nd in Philadelphia.
Yeah, and we know that Mary Coddington would have been read out of meeting for marrying outside of her faith, her tradition. So again, it's an interesting story. I wanted to, you mentioned Trent being a staunch supporter of the Anglican Church. Do you want to say a little bit about this catechism that is actually dedicated to him?
Yeah, this book, actually, the one of the originals, this was sort of like, it was published from what the date said in 1719, but it was circulated not only in the colonies, but also throughout England. I mean, it sort of see it on the bottom left there. It says London on the bottom. And it was basically just given, I guess there were dedications normally throughout the years to people that showed their great dedication to the Anglican Church, or, maybe spreading the word of it, hence the key to the church catechism. And this particular one, in 1719, right around the time that, Trent would have had his house officially completed there, had this thing dedicated to him. And it was it was basically, and you can see a little bit of it on there, but it's saying that, his goodwill and basically his spreading of the word for this, of being that. And by 1719, he had already served as basically had served as why he was a vestryman at Christ Church in Philadelphia. And then eventually adamant with the everything, eventually the Church, Church of England, when we eventually settled in Trenton permanently.
Yeah, that was something I had known about. One other mystery you helped us solve. We thought the top signature here was our Judge Trent signature, and we were going to use it on our website. We sent it off to Jason to look at. Jason, you want to tell us what you found?
Yeah, I mean, I know when it was brought to my attention, thought this was William, and like I said, it's hard to tell because we don't have but noticing, and like I said, originally when I saw it too, I was like, I had seen enough signatures basically of Judge Trent to sort of know, and I was like, well, it's somewhat similar, but I said, it didn't seem like it was, and I saw the N there, I thought maybe it was the M was cut off, and that's why, but then I realized he rarely ever signed his name, especially at that time period, with an M there. And so he would end up, see as the below signature, just the WILL and then the sort of the M on top. As much as it looks like an N, believe it or not, there's numerous, and this was off an oath of allegiance with William Penn in the early 1700s that they did to King William. And that's how everybody had their sort of signature, type that would come through, that you'd see it and you'd know it was theirs. So judging by that and going back into sort of the records I had, John Trent, which was another son with Maurice and James, had a similar, and he was at clerks of the county at the time, what it was known then as Hunterdon County. And so comparing that with the signature, realizing that this was actually one of the sons and not actually Judge Trent himself.
Yeah, so now we were able to use the bottom signature on our website, and you'll see it on our pages toward on the bottom. And I want to just mention one last thing that has been so helpful to us that Jason brought to our attention. And I'll have him tell you the story of how he found it. But this is a runaway ad from the 1729 New York Gazette. About an enslaved person, a slave man named Yoff, who had run away from James Alexander. As you can see on sort of the third and fourth lines, it was stated in it he formerly belonged to Mr. Trent. That confirms that this man, Yoff, was one of the enslaved people who was listed on Judge Trent's inventory when he died in 1724. The other information in there helps us tell a story about Yoff that we were not able to say before, because all we had known from the inventory was he was listed as a man named Yoff at 45 pounds was the assessed price that was given in the inventory. But now we know more about his history, his skills, his personality, and so on. And this what has been so helpful to us. Jason, you want to end up by telling us a little bit about how you came across this for us?
Sure. Yeah, it was funny because I know when we were going back and forth with the Trent House, I think, Sam and I was saying, well, we were trying to learn more about the, enslaved servants and stuff that were at the Trent House. And I said, yeah, as I keep looking, I'll try to find some of this stuff either based on the inventories or receipts or something that might come up. And I just happened to, I think I just had been Googling the names through the history sites that I'd done just with Trent and used the Yoff thing. And one came up saying that there was I saw sort of a reference to it, and it said New York Gazette, whatever. And I was trying to see if there was a way to get into I know newspaper.com, but a lot of the places that you do have to have a subscription or something. And I was able to see that they had so many papers online, but you could also search by keyword search. And when it came up from the New York Gazette, it was like 1720s. I typed in Yoff's name and this article came up. And as I was reading it, I'm like, okay, well, it didn't really say. And then, I got to about the fourth line and then I see belong to Mr. Trent. So I'm like, oh, okay, great. It actually verified that, because we could just see the name and, maybe assume, but not for sure actually believe it about that. And, and I try to, like I said, when I do research, especially on these type of articles, I'll look up, any name that's even on here. Now, James Alexander, he sort of helped us too. I think Sam and I were just talking about this earlier, was basically, it said, he escaped from James Alexander after, because it looks like from what it was believed then after being that he was listed on the inventory of Judge Trent in 1720. Well, at that time, after he died in 1724, he made an inventory that eventually came out in 1726. And Yoff was listed on there, like Sam said on there. Well, it says in this article that he escaped or ran away from James Alexander. And I sort of followed up on sort of the background just to give me an idea about James Alexander. Well, as I was doing that, in the Supreme Court files at the New Jersey State Archives, it said there was much debt owed from not only Judge Trent to James Alexander, being that he was, either bought goods or possibly, but James Alexander also, and it actually said in the court case, where it was filed, and it said Middlesex County in New Jersey there, in which at that time was sort of where the governor was, that rolled over, because at that point there was East Jersey and West Jersey, but the governor basically ruled both of those. And usually the governor of New Jersey at that time was also the governor of New York. So it varied on where the governor was able to file. Well, these debts not only went to Judge Trent, well, the administrator of Judge Trent, and at that time, that person would be James, his eldest son. So there was a court case in 1725 that James wished to be repaid for so much money. And I didn't find a result because normally they don't tell you the results, just what went on in the case. Well, then about 4 years later, around about the same year of when Yoff would run away, they actually had that James Alexander did win the suit in 1725, but was owed more money from, it looked like, from James. So it is quite possible, based on the assumptions and what we know from this news article, that, James Alexander might have to repay this debt of maybe the suit he won in 1725, or possibly even 1728 or 29. Yoff was included in this just because, unfortunately, the enslaved servants basically were sold, of things of value back then. And so that's what led it to believe. And then going back on that whole thing with even before Trent, it'd say Colonel Inglesby. And I was following up on that, and there's more a tie into that as well, because Richard Inglesby was also the governor of New York and New Jersey in like 1709, 1710. But he also was the one that granted the license to build Hopewell Church, which is where the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital is, just outside of Trenton. And that land became the I believe what they call it, Sam, is it the Breeze Farm, or what was known then?
I think so. Yeah.
And then they were able to build that church there because they didn't have a really Church of England building. So in the early 1700s, about, I believe it was like 1705, 06, they built Hopewell Church right on the grounds of where today is this Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. And, like I said, Richard Inglesby was able to grant them the license to build a church. And that's where they would happen to worship, because at that time, the people that settled, early 1700s, or at least by, 17, when Trentstown became an actual settlement, they were going to probably Burlington or maybe even across the river to Philadelphia to worship in the Anglican Church. So by having that there, Hopewell Church was able to do up there. Well, eventually, because of the rectors that were going back and forth from Philadelphia to Hopewell, it was easier for the diocese to send the Church of England's to one that was either established or leave them in Philadelphia. So they built eventually in 1760s, 1761 to be exact. They obtained land from the former Judge Trent's land that he eventually divvied out when he died, after his son divvied it out to other buyers, and they built St. Michael's Episcopal Church on North Warren Street. And it's funny because this all leads to, and I know we had a question here. Princess had it in the chat, was why we don't have much information about his death, about Judge Trent's death. And basically because from what I found in the was that with that Hopewell Church that was on that land north of Trenton, and the eventual records were sort of lost, and they have what's available, but eventually that became sort of abandoned, and they used St. Michael's Episcopal later, about 50 some years later. So, but at that time, the Hopewell Church was being there was like a rector that was doing Philadelphia, Burlington, and he was doing like 3 other churches. There was one in Maidenhead, which was, down the road there. So it was too hard for him to be going all these places. And I do find a reference to the rector, I believe it was William Harrison, actually staying at the Trent House in 1721 before Easter. And the snow was so bad he couldn't leave the Trent House, and he was trying to go to Hopewell. Eventually he would go to Philadelphia. And I believe, based on this, and especially later when Mary Coddington Trent dies in 1772, she's listed in the St. Michael's Episcopal records as of her death being in December of 1772. And we figure out if she wasn't buried right in that churchyard, and where it is today, it's probably up in Hopewell Church, because that was the first Church of England, and then eventually everybody transferred when they got. But most people were being buried, at least till the end of the Revolution, up in Hopewell Churchyard. And unfortunately, they do have it, like the grounds, there's still like a brickyard on the grounds. And that's why it's possible that Judge Trent is buried there, as well as Mary Coddington, because it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for her to be buried up there, especially next to her husband, if he was already buried there since 1724. So, and like I said, and that's why sort of with the Hopewell Church records being minimal, that's why you don't really see too much about his, of where he's been buried. And I believe that's pretty much what it is, because I know some contemporary, at least modern day authors try to say he was buried in Riverview Cemetery, the one that we know today. But back then, that was considered the Thomas Lambert burial ground. And that was only a Quaker cemetery. So there's no way they would have never allowed an Anglican to be buried in a Quaker cemetery, because it didn't become an actual, non-denominational one till at least past the 1800s. And ironically, that Riverview Cemetery, where that is, just not far from there, is where Major Trent would live from 1769 to 1775 or 1784.
Lamberton, yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions? This has been very, very helpful. I learned more things. I now know there's some more things I'm going to try to ask you to give us copies of that you've mentioned. Just hearing about your research is really exciting to understand how you need to follow the paths that lead you and verify, which is really helpful. Any last question? Oh, now here's a question. Is it possible that the young wife, Mary William Trent, was mistaken for the daughter, perhaps? That's possible.
It's amazing how that sometimes, as even discussing this, it's amazing. If you don't, disorient, we're looking at the, even the daughter, we look at the men, like it was William Trent of Inverness, and then it was Judge Trent, and then it was Major Trent. If you just refer to it as William in there, and if a date is wrong, you're never going to know the difference. I said, they weren't based it on the sort of the Scottish naming or even the Anglican naming system as far as everything. So yeah, it's very possible. And then you figure William Trent's Judge Trent's first wife was also Mary.
Yeah.
So, and it got to the point that, as a researcher, as a historian, if you're doing, I'm just doing it to sort of get this biography and get me an idea. If you're doing it for your own family history, you're trying to, it's confusing. Everybody knows to the point they weren't real original when it came to names, because they had that naming system. So there could be, it'd be like myself doing it and finding out there were 8 Jasons in a row and everybody just kept naming their name. They're not putting the, I did research for like Trent's, a guy that he served under as an apprentice, Edward Shippen. There were so many Shippens that were Edward. It got to I think they had the numeral, but sometimes they just referred to them as Edward. So you better look at the names if you're trying to, that's why I always used Edward Shippen III, because if I didn't, you'd refer to it as the Edward Shippen the first or the second, or however that worked. But yeah, it's very possible that's probably the confusion came, because it's like I said, the young Mary Burge wasn't around that much. And she's always mistaken, even in some books today, she's mistaken as being the second wife and not the first. And, and then Mary Coddington being as young as she is. Yeah, it's very possible they assumed when they saw the name, especially if it was transcribed wrong or just confusing to the person that was researching, that it possibly, yeah, it would have mistaken, and then somebody took it as, oh, I wrote this and wrote it down, and then you assume it's right.
Right. One of the things that we'll wrap up here, but we've been going through the documents that are in our little mini archive that we have, and there, often are copies of books on secondary analyses, secondary books, not original documents, and even then, we don't necessarily know what book it was from. So someone will make a nice Xerox copy, put in our files of a page that lists William Trent, but we don't know what book it came from. So again, sometimes we just sort of have to go back and start from scratch, which is where Jason has been such a valuable asset to us. Well, I want to thank everyone for being on the call, looking at our video. Thanks very much and have a good day. Bye, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.